They say that silence is golden, but sometimes silence is not an agreement. It is not acceptance. It is a gathering storm, a pressure building behind a dam of patience, waiting for the precise moment to break free and wash away everything in its path. In the quiet, sun-drenched rooms of a Malibu mansion overlooking the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean, Alara Vance had become an expert in silence. To the world, she was a tragedy whispered about at charity galas and in the glossy pages of magazines. Alara Vance, the architectural prodigy, the brilliant heiress to the Vance construction empire, now confined to a wheelchair, a beautiful statue of what could have been. 1 year. It had been 1 year since the night that shattered her world. The memory still came in fractured pieces, a kaleidoscope of horror, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the blinding glare of oncoming headlights, the violent, world-ending crunch of metal folding in on itself. Then, darkness, punctuated by the sterile white of a hospital ceiling and the cold, clinical voice of a doctor delivering a life sentence. "We're very sorry, Miss Vance. The damage to your spine is severe. It's unlikely you'll ever walk again." Beside her hospital bed, her devoted husband, Julian, had held her hand, his handsome face a perfect mask of grief, tears streaming down his cheeks. Her best friend, her confidant, her personal assistant, Chloe, had sobbed into his shoulder. They promised her everything. They promised they would never leave her side, that they would be her legs, her strength, her reason to keep going. And they had kept their promise, in a way. They were always there, floating through her magnificent home like solicitous ghosts, their voices a constant murmur of concern. They managed her affairs, answered her calls, and told everyone how bravely she was handling her new reality. From her chair, Alara watched them. She watched the way Julian's hand lingered on Chloe's back for just a moment too long. She saw the fleeting, triumphant spark in Chloe's eyes when she thought Alara wasn't looking. On the surface, Alara was a broken woman, her eyes as vacant as the horizon over the ocean, her face a placid lake of acceptance. But beneath that still water, a fire raged. She was not broken, she was observing. She was not grieving, she was collecting. Her silence was not the silence of despair. It was the patient, calculating silence of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to remind the lambs just who the lion was. Before the wheelchair, before the suffocating quiet of her own home, Alara Vance's life was a symphony of controlled, beautiful noise. It was the scratch of her pen across architectural drafts, the confident click of her heels on the polished marble floors of the Vance construction headquarters, the low hum of a boardroom giving her its undivided attention. She wasn't simply the daughter of the great Marcus Vance. She was his successor, the soul of the company he had built from the ground up. Where her father had laid the foundation with concrete and steel, Alara had given the company its skyline, its iconic silhouette against the American landscape. She designed buildings that seemed to breathe, structures that married brutalist strength with elegant, impossible curves. She could see the soul of a building in a plot of empty land, and she could command a room of seasoned engineers and hardened contractors with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. She had earned her place, not by inheritance, but by sheer, undeniable brilliance. Her life was a testament to precision, vision, and the unwavering belief that she was the architect of her own fate. Into this meticulously designed life walked Julian. He was, by all accounts, perfect, with sharp suits, a smile that could disarm the most hostile board member, and a mind for finance that was as sharp as a razor's edge. He was exactly what Vance Construction needed as its new chief financial officer. But he became so much more. He wasn't intimidated by her power. He seemed to celebrate it. He would listen for hours as she spoke of glass facades and cantilevered balconies, his eyes alight with what she believed was genuine fascination. He called her his visionary, his force of nature. Theirs was a romance that the media adored, the brilliant heiress and the self-made financial wizard. They were the ultimate power couple, their wedding a lavish affair that spoke of old money and new ambition. Alara had loved him with the same intensity she poured into her work, completely and without reservation. She saw his ambition as a mirror of her own, a shared drive to build an empire together. She had failed to see the subtle but crucial difference. Alara wanted to build monuments, while Julian simply wanted to own them. He loved the view from the top, but he had no interest in the climb, especially if someone else could do the heavy lifting for him. And by Alara's side, through it all, was Chloe. Their friendship was the kind of legend that people talk about with a hint of envy. They had met in college, two young women with big dreams, and their bond had only deepened over the years. When Chloe's career faltered, Alara had brought her on as her personal assistant without a second thought. It was a role that Chloe transformed, becoming Alara's right hand, her shadow, her external hard drive. Chloe knew where every file was, every password, every secret appointment. She knew how Alara took her coffee, and she knew which investors needed to be charmed and which needed to be strong-armed. Alara trusted her implicitly, sharing vulnerabilities and whispered fears that she shared with no one else, not even Julian. In Chloe, Alara saw a reflection of her own loyalty, a sister forged not by blood, but by choice. She had given Chloe keys to her home, her life, her deepest secrets, never once imagining that each key was being diligently copied for a lock she didn't know existed. The trust was so absolute, so blinding, that Alara never noticed the quiet resentment simmering beneath Chloe's perfect efficiency, the subtle envy in her eyes every time she watched Alara command a room. The final ornate pillar in this grand structure of her life was her mother-in-law, Beatrice Vance. A formidable matriarch of East Coast society, Beatrice moved through the world with an air of unshakable entitlement. Publicly, she adored Alara. She would touch her cheek at family gatherings, her fingers cold despite the warmth of her smile, and praise her daughter-in-law's latest architectural triumph. "We are all so terribly proud of Alara," she would announce to her circle of friends. "She is so driven. It is truly remarkable what she accomplishes." Julian is endlessly supportive, but her compliments were always double-edged swords, designed to subtly diminish. By praising Alara's drive, she implied it was unladylike. By highlighting Julian's support, she painted him as the patient, noble husband managing a work-obsessed wife. Beatrice had wanted a different kind of woman for her son, one who would manage his home, raise his children, and reflect his glory, not eclipse it. She saw Alara's success not as a family asset, but as a personal affront, an imbalance in the natural order of power. She was a woman who believed that the Vance name and the power that came with it belonged to her son, and by extension, to her. Alara was merely a temporary custodian, a gifted but inconvenient obstacle to her son's rightful inheritance. This was the world Alara Vance had inhabited, a world of power, love, and what she believed was unwavering loyalty. A beautiful, gilded cage she had built for herself, decorated with a loving husband, a devoted best friend, and an admiring family. She was the queen of her own creation, admired, respected, and in control. She moved through her days with the confidence of a woman who believed in the structural integrity of her life, never realizing that the foundations were riddled with decay, that the people she held closest were the ones secretly chipping away at the very pillars that held her up. They smiled at her, they praised her, and all the while, they were waiting, planning for the day the entire magnificent structure would come crashing down around her. The days following the accident bled into weeks, and the weeks into months, each one a mirror of the last. Alara's world had shrunk to the dimensions of her home, a sprawling glass and steel testament to her own genius that now felt more like an opulent prison. The initial, frantic wave of sympathy from the outside world had subsided, replaced by a polite, distant pity. Her life settled into a quiet, monotonous rhythm, dictated by medication schedules and physical therapy sessions that yielded no results. Julian was the picture of doting concern, always ready with a soft blanket or a gentle word. Chloe was a whirlwind of efficiency, managing the household, the staff, and Alara's schedule with a seamless competence that everyone praised. They were her pillars, her caregivers, her connection to the world she had lost. And for a time, Alara allowed herself to lean on them, to drift in the fog of grief and pain. But the mind of an architect is trained to see what others miss. It is a mind that understands foundations, stress points, and the tiny, almost invisible cracks that can threaten the integrity of an entire structure. And in the quiet stillness of her new life, Alara began to see the cracks. It started with the phone calls. Julian, who had once shared every detail of his day, now spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. He would end a call with her, his voice warm and loving, then step into his study, and through the thick mahogany door, she would hear a different voice, a low, urgent, clipped cadence she didn't recognize. He called them late-night calls with the European markets or stressful negotiations with difficult clients. But the names of the companies and the projects he mentioned felt foreign to her. She still had the entire Vance construction portfolio memorized, a mental blueprint of every deal and every deadline. Julian's stories didn't align with that blueprint. They were like a badly rendered edition, architecturally unsound, and it made her uneasy. Then there was Chloe. Her friend's helpfulness began to feel less like support and more like an occupation. She moved through the house with an unearned familiarity, no longer an assistant but a cohabitant. She would rearrange furniture, arguing that it was better for the flow of the wheelchair. She hired a new chef without consulting Alara because she felt the old one wasn't meeting Alara's new dietary needs. She answered the phone with a breezy Vance residence, her voice imbued with a sense of ownership. One afternoon, a financial planner, an old friend of Alara's father, came to visit. Chloe sat in on the meeting, and Alara, in her medicated haze, mostly listened. At one point, the planner asked a direct question about liquidating a certain stock portfolio. Before Alara could form a response, Chloe had answered for her. "We feel it's best to be cautious for now," she'd said, using the royal we with unnerving ease. The planner had glanced at Alara, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but Chloe had smoothly redirected the conversation. In that moment, Alara felt like a ghost in her own life, a silent, powerless spectator. The first piece of tangible proof, the first hairline crack she could trace with her finger, came on a Tuesday. Julian had left a stack of mail on her nightstand, mostly catalogs and letters of sympathy. Tucked inside a glossy magazine was a receipt from a boutique on Rodeo Drive, a place known for its exquisite, astronomically expensive jewelry. It was dated 6 weeks prior. The item purchased was a custom-designed platinum and diamond tennis bracelet. Alara stared at it, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. It wasn't her birthday. It wasn't their anniversary. She had received no such gift. She closed her eyes, her mind racing back 6 weeks. Julian had told her he was in grueling, back-to-back board meetings that day, that he was so exhausted he had barely had time for lunch. Yet, according to this crisp piece of paper, he had found the time to purchase a gift fit for a queen who was not her. She hid the receipt, the paper feeling cold and dangerous in her hand, a secret she now shared with the walls. The final, shattering blow came not as a bang, but as a whisper. It was a warm afternoon, and Alara was in the sunroom, her head tilted back, her eyes closed. The gentle warmth on her skin had nearly lulled her to sleep. She heard Julian and Chloe enter the adjoining living room, their footsteps soft on the Persian rug. They must have thought she was asleep. Their voices were low, conspiratorial murmurs that sliced through the quiet air. "Beatrice is getting impatient," Julian said, his voice stripped of all its practiced warmth, leaving only a core of cold ambition. "She wants the power of attorney finalized. She says his old loyalists on the board are starting to ask questions." Chloe's reply was a soothing hiss. "They can't prove anything. The doctor's reports are clear. Just a little more patience, Julian. Once we have control of her shares, we can do whatever we want. Just a little longer, and it will all be ours. It will all be ours." The words echoed in the silent chamber of Alara's mind. In that instant, the fog of the past year evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused clarity. The concerned husband, the loyal friend. It was all a performance, a meticulously crafted play designed to fool the world and her. They weren't her caregivers, they were her jailers. This magnificent house wasn't her sanctuary, it was their stage. The unease, the suspicion, the stray puzzle pieces all snapped into place, forming a picture so monstrous it stole her breath. She didn't move a muscle. Her breathing remained slow and even, her face a mask of serene sleep. But behind her closed eyelids, Elara Vance was more awake than she had ever been in her life. The foundation of her world had cracked, and through that crack, she could finally see the venomous things that had been festering in the darkness beneath. She didn't know the full extent of their plan, but she knew one thing with chilling certainty. The game had begun, and she would not be a pawn in it. She would be the architect of their destruction. Sleep did not come to Elara that night, nor the night after. The monster she now saw was not a stranger who had broken into her home. It was the home itself. The two people she had trusted most in the world were her captors, and every gentle touch, every concerned word was now revealed as a carefully constructed lie. The initial shock, that searing, white-hot pain of betrayal, did not fade. Instead, it began to cool, to harden, to transform into something else entirely. It became a cold, dense, and incredibly heavy substance in the pit of her stomach. Resolve. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Despair was a cage she refused to inhabit. She was an architect, and her mind, even in a body that had failed her, knew how to build. Now, it would learn how to demolish. Her prison was of her own design, and within its walls, she had built secrets. Years ago, during the mansion's construction, she had overseen the installation of a state-of-the-art integrated home system she'd playfully nicknamed the Sentinel. On the surface, it controlled the lighting, the temperature, the music. But beneath that veneer of convenience lay its true purpose: security. At her direction, the contractors had embedded microscopic cameras and audio sensors into the walls of every major room: the study, the living room, the kitchen, even her own bedroom. She had justified it to Julian as a cutting-edge diagnostic system to monitor the home's structural integrity and climate controls. In truth, it was a reflection of a quiet, deep-seated part of her that never fully trusted the world. It was a system she had deactivated a year into their marriage, a testament to the love she thought had made such precautions obsolete. Now, that dormant system was her only path to freedom. Late one night, when the rhythmic sound of Julian's breathing filled the master suite, Elara began her work. Her hands, which had once commanded blueprints the size of tables, now moved with stealthy precision across the cool glass of her tablet. Julian and Chloe had given it to her for entertainment, a tool to passively consume books and movies. They had no idea she had designed the tablet's operating system to interface directly with the Sentinel's core programming. Accessing it was not simple. Julian, ever the cautious planner, had installed new firewalls. But he was a financier, not a creator. He knew how to buy security, not how to build it. He could not anticipate the backdoors and kill switches that Elara, the system's architect, had woven into its very source code. Her fingers flew across the virtual keyboard, lines of code scrolling past in the dim light, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every creak of the house, every distant siren, felt like the footsteps of discovery. Then, after a tense, breathless 30 minutes, a simple, beautiful word appeared in the center of the screen: "Welcome, Elara." A cascade of small windows opened, revealing live feeds from every corner of her life. She had eyes again. She had ears. The hunter was now in the watchtower. Her days transformed. Outwardly, she was the same. She stared out the window. She picked at her food. She offered weak smiles when spoken to. But inwardly, she was a voracious consumer of information. Her tablet lay on her lap, hidden beneath a cashmere blanket, one video feed playing silently in the corner of an e-book page. Through a discreet, flesh-colored hearing aid, a gift from Chloe, who had insisted Elara's hearing was surely affected by the trauma, she became a permanent, invisible audience to the lives of her betrayers. And what she witnessed systematically dismantled the last vestiges of the woman she had once been. She saw the kiss. It wasn't a stolen, passionate moment of forbidden love. It was worse. It was casual. Chloe was at the kitchen island, preparing Elara's morning smoothie, and Julian came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and kissing the nape of her neck as she laughed. It was the easy intimacy of a long-established couple, a gesture performed 1,000 times before. The pain was sharp and visceral, a physical blow, but Alara did not cry. She simply watched, her expression unchanging, and filed it away. This was not a crime of passion. This was a conspiracy. She listened to them in the study as they spoke with their lawyers. They used cold, clinical terms to describe the dismantling of her life's work. "We'll need to petition the court to declare her mentally incompetent," a voice on the speakerphone advised. Her refusal to engage in more aggressive physical therapy can be framed as a symptom of severe depression and cognitive decline. Julian's voice was smooth as he replied, "That won't be a problem. She barely speaks. She just sits and stares all day. It's a tragedy." He spoke of her as if she were an object, a problem to be managed, a set of stocks to be liquidated. The cruelest moments were the most personal. One evening, she watched the feed from her own walk-in closet. Chloe was in there alone, a glass of wine in her hand. She moved through the rows of designer clothes, her fingers caressing the fabrics. Then she pulled out the stunning custom-made gown Alara had worn to their last anniversary celebration. Chloe held it up against her own body, turning and posing in front of the mirror, a smug, triumphant smile on her face. A moment later, Julian appeared in the doorway. He didn't look shocked or disapproving. He leaned against the frame, a smirk on his face, and said, "It looks better on you anyway." With every word, every stolen glance, every act of casual cruelty, the love Alara once felt for these two people was burned away, leaving behind something harder, something forged and sharp. She learned to school her features into a perfect mask of placid emptiness. She responded to their questions in monosyllables. She became the broken, fragile doll they wanted her to be. But beneath the blanket, her fingers were always busy, recording conversations, taking screenshots, archiving financial documents they foolishly accessed on the home network. She was no longer a victim trapped in a wheelchair. She was a silent archivist of their sins, the architect of a case so airtight, so damning, that when the time came, they would have nowhere to run. The whispers in the walls had confirmed her greatest fears, but they had also given her the blueprint for her revenge. She now knew the what, but the why still felt incomplete. An affair and greed seemed too simple. She had a chilling suspicion that the conspiracy went deeper, that the whispers had not yet revealed the darkest secret of all. For weeks, Alara existed in a dual reality. In one, she was a silent, broken figure in a wheelchair. In the other, she was a spy master, an omnipresent ghost in her own house, meticulously documenting the treason that unfolded around her. She had hours of audio and video evidence, a digital tapestry woven from the whispers of her husband and her best friend. She had proof of their affair, a sordid, passionless convenience. She had a clear outline of their financial plot, a methodical and greedy scheme to seize control of her assets and her company. She had enough to ruin them, to expose them as adulterers and thieves. And yet, a chilling sense of incompleteness haunted her. The picture felt unfinished. The scale of their betrayal, the sheer, cold-blooded efficiency of it, seemed to demand a grander motive than just lust and money. There was a missing piece of the blueprint, a foundational secret she had yet to uncover. The revelation came on a Thursday evening, cloaked in the mundane. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the mansion, the sky a bruised purple. Julian had retreated to his study after dinner, claiming he had an urgent call with an overseas investor. Alara, from her position in the darkened hallway, watched the live feed from the camera embedded in his desktop monitor. She saw him straighten his tie, run a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and initiate a video call. An image flickered onto his screen, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was Beatrice. Her mother-in-law was in her lavish Hampton study, a portrait of aristocratic elegance with her silver hair coiled perfectly and a string of pearls glowing against her silk blouse. Her smile was thin, impatient. "You're late, Julian," Beatrice began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I trust you have good news." Julian shifted in his chair, his usual confidence evaporating under his mother's gaze. "It's progressing, Mother. The lawyers are drafting the final competency hearing petitions. It just takes time." Beatrice's nostrils flared in a barely perceptible sign of contempt. "Time is not a luxury we have. Marcus's old cronies on the board are starting to rally. They're whispering. They're questioning why Alara hasn't been seen, why all communication is being routed through you. Your wife's unfortunate condition is a perfect excuse, but excuses, like sympathy, have an expiration date. Julian's composure finally cracked. "What do you want me to do?" he snapped, his voice a petulant whine. "I'm doing everything. I have to sit with her, eat with her, pretend to read to her. I have to play the part of the heartbroken, devoted husband every single second of every day. Do you have any idea how draining that is? To look into her empty eyes and lie?" It was at this moment that Beatrice leaned closer to her camera, her face filling the screen, her eyes like chips of ice. And she delivered the words that would demolish Alara's world completely. "Oh, stop your whining, Julian. Don't be so pathetically weak. You wanted this as much as I did. We created the perfect opportunity for you, and all you do is complain about the performance." The mechanic was paid a small fortune to do a very simple job. It was meant to be a clean break. Understand? A fault in the braking system, a tragic accident on a winding road. Enough to put her in that chair, not in a coffin. Enough to give you absolute control without the vulgarity of a murder investigation. It was a gift, Julian. I handed you an empire. Now, stop complaining and finish what we started. In the hallway, the world around Alara dissolved. The sound from her earpiece became a deafening roar, the voice of the rain outside, the beating of her own heart, the memory of screeching metal, all merging into one unbearable crescendo. A scream, primal and raw, clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down, the effort sending a tremor through her entire body. Her hands clamped down on the wheels of her chair, her knuckles turning bone white, the cold metal biting into her skin. The memory of the crash, the one she had tried so hard to suppress, came flooding back, no longer a chaotic series of fractured images, but a slow-motion horror film with a clear director, the way the brakes had failed to catch. The feeling of utter helplessness as the car veered towards the headlights. The final, bone-shattering impact. It wasn't fate, it wasn't an accident, it was an appointment. They had tried to murder her, and they had failed, leaving her entombed in a broken body, a fate they considered a success. The betrayal was no longer about a broken heart or a stolen fortune. This was a violation so profound, so monstrous, that her mind struggled to comprehend it. The man who had vowed to love and protect her, the woman who had called her daughter, had calmly plotted to end her life, to paralyze her, to turn her into a living ghost so they could pick through the bones of her life. The pain was an ocean, vast and black, and for a moment, she felt herself drowning in it. But then, something else rose from those depths. It was not grief, it was not fear. It was a rage so pure, so cold, so absolute, that it burned away everything else. It was the rage of a survivor. The last remnants of the soft, trusting Alara Vance were incinerated in that fire. What remained was forged into something new, something hard and sharp and utterly unforgiving. On the screen, Julian, chastened and pale, nodded at his mother. "You're right, I'll handle it." The call ended, leaving him alone in the study, a puppet whose strings had just been pulled taut. Alara slowly, silently, wheeled herself back to her bedroom. She stopped in front of the large, darkened window that acted as a mirror in the night. She looked at the reflection, at the pale face and the wide, haunted eyes. She did not recognize the woman staring back at her. The woman in the glass was not a victim. She was a weapon waiting to be fired. The whispers had finally revealed the name of the true architect of her ruin. Not Julian, the weak and greedy pawn. It was Beatrice. Beatrice, the smiling, venomous matriarch. And in that moment, Alara Vance's mission was no longer about revenge. It was about righteous, biblical retribution, and she would bring it down upon them all. The reality she now faced was a cage far more confining than her wheelchair. She was not just a victim of a horrible accident, she was a target of premeditated cruelty, confined to a beautiful prison by the very people who had sworn to love and protect her. The cold efficiency of Julian and Beatrice's plot was breathtaking. They hadn't wanted her dead, which would have been messy and instantaneous. They wanted her incapacitated, legally nullified, a living, breathing casualty stripped of capacity and control. Her paralysis was their tool, her vulnerability their greatest asset. But they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They had confused Alara's silence for acceptance and her physical stillness for mental stagnation. Alara, the architect who could envision the entire structure from a single blueprint, was already drafting her counterattack. Her first act of defiance was minuscule, invisible to the surveillance cameras and the watchful eyes of her carers. It was the retrieval of the burner phone, a tiny, outdated flip phone she had purchased years ago for a covert business trip, a ghost device tucked securely inside the hollowed-out spine of an architectural textbook Julian never bothered to open. The book, The Geometry of Justice, sat innocently on her bedside table. With trembling, often ineffective fingers, she managed to activate the device. The challenge was not just the physical act, it was the psychological burden of trust. Whom could she call? Her father's old business associates were too entangled with Julian now. Her lawyers had already been compromised. She needed someone outside the gilded cage, someone loyal to the idea of her, not her money. She thought of Arthur Moreau, a physical therapist who had briefly worked with her father years ago after a minor ski injury. Arthur was an old-school professional, known for his unshakable discretion and a stern, almost military approach to rehabilitation. He had been dismissed by Julian shortly after the accident, under the pretense that a more modern, in-house team was required, which, Alara now realized, was just another layer of isolation. The call was a terrifying risk, a single shot into the dark. Her voice, unused for conveying anything but polite, detached resignation for months, felt like rusty machinery. "Arthur," she whispered into the phone one Tuesday evening, just after Chloe had administered her sleeping pill and left the room. "It's Alara Vance. I need your help. I need to walk again, and they cannot know." Arthur's response was not shock or pity, but a low, measured gravity that soothed her raw nerves. "I knew they dismissed me for a reason, Alara. I saw the look in their eyes. Tell me what you need, and when. I have no price but your absolute commitment." The pact was sealed in the dead of night. The training regimen became Alara's secret life, a ritual of excruciating pain and iron will. Arthur would arrive at 2 a.m., slipping through the rarely used service entrance near the greenhouse, a spot Alara knew had a consistent blind spot in Julian's rigged security system. He never rang, never knocked, moving with the silence of a shadow. Their initial sessions were devastating. Alara's muscles had atrophied, her nerves were sluggish, and the physical memory of standing was a distant echo. The pain was immediate and blinding, a fiery protest from every unused fiber of her body. Arthur was relentless. He used no fancy equipment, just gravity, resistance, and a will stronger than hers. "Focus, Alara," he would grunt, holding her waist as she attempted a single, assisted lunge. "The mind leads the body, not the other way around. They took your legs, but they haven't taken your brain. Visualize the step." Alara would bite back the screams, sinking her teeth into a rolled-up towel. She wasn't visualizing a step, she was visualizing the walk across the marble floor of a church, the walk that would shatter their carefully constructed reality. Every session was a strategic victory against Julian and Chloe's contempt. They had designed her life to be stationary, the accessible ramps, the motorized chair, the convenient bedside commode. Everything was designed to reinforce the narrative of the helpless, broken woman. Alara used their setup against them. She would push herself on the chair for hours during the day, making them believe it was just getting exercise, when in fact, she was building upper body strength necessary for balance and covert movement. She had to be meticulous about details. The smell of Arthur's liniment had to be masked by strong essential oils. The fatigue that left her drenched in sweat had to be hidden by cold showers, explained away as night terrors. The deep, muscle-knotting aches had to be endured silently, lest a whimper alert the vigilant ears of Chloe, who often slept in the guest wing nearest her. One night, after 3 months of agonizing secrecy, Alara did it. She stood unassisted for 10 full seconds. The feeling was not triumph. It was pure, unadulterated power. For 10 seconds, she was no longer the victim. She was the mistress of her own verticality. Arthur simply nodded, his face stern. 10 seconds today. We need a clean minute. Without the limp, justice does not hobble Alara. It strides. During the days, the facade intensified. Alara played the role of the docile, depressed patient flawlessly. She would ask Chloe for a specific, seemingly trivial brand of herbal tea, knowing it would send Chloe out of the house for an hour. That hour was used for her most crucial, non-physical work, digital counter-espionage. She was listening to their every word, monitoring their movements, but she also knew they were monitoring her. They were waiting for her to sign the final papers, to liquidate the last of her inheritance. They were like vultures circling a carcass they believed was already dead. The greatest illusion I have ever constructed was not a building, Alara mused to herself one afternoon, staring blankly at the ocean, while Julian prattled on about the difficulty of managing her medical trust fund. It is the illusion of my own defeat. Her recovery was not just physical, it was an act of psychological warfare. Every stretch, every painful attempt to move her toes was a silent investment in the day she would walk into their future and take back her past. The stillness of the mansion, the quiet waves breaking on the shore, the monotonous rhythm of her life, all were a mask for the tumultuous, fiery rebirth happening within her own body. She was not just walking away from the wheelchair, she was walking towards justice. And every night, the loyal Arthur was there, a quiet accomplice in the most dangerous and inspiring journey of Alara's life. They thought they had crippled her. They had only transformed her into an unbreakable weapon. The clock of personal justice rarely moves quickly, the storyteller would observe. It requires patience, grit, and the kind of silence that terrifies those who mistake it for weakness. Julian and Chloe, basking in the glow of their imminent victory, believed they had sealed off every avenue of resistance. They saw Alara, day after day, listlessly scrolling through interior design blogs or reading digitized classic literature. They interpreted this as resignation, the final surrender of a broken mind. They had no idea that beneath the veneer of decorative pillows and romantic poetry, Alara was weaving a financial counterstrike so intricate, so deliberately misleading, that it would make their own betrayal look like a child's game of theft. Alara's background as an architect gave her a unique advantage. She thought in systems, in structural integrity, and in the inevitable points of failure. She knew how the Vance empire was built, and she knew exactly which keystones Julian was trying to remove. Her first critical move was to establish a truly secure line of communication. She downloaded a highly encrypted, self-destructing messaging app onto her tablet, disguising the icon as a weather widget. The only 2 contacts she trusted implicitly were Marcus Thorne, her late father's personal counsel and the man who handled the Vance family's most sensitive legal maneuvers, and Eleanor Ellie Cho, the quiet, brilliant chief financial officer who had managed Vance Construction's liquid assets for 2 decades. Both had been pushed to the periphery by Julian after the accident, but their loyalty to the Vance name was unshakable. The messages were short, cryptic, and urgent. They never named Julian or Chloe directly, referring to them only as the management team or the interim trustees. To Marcus Thorne, re-examine the ironclad trust documentation, specifically Clause 4. The beneficiaries listed under incapacity must be verified. Require immediate confirmation of the original settlor's intent. The ironclad trust was the ancient legal shield her grandfather had created, a complex, multi-layered structure designed to protect the Vance legacy from corporate raiding or familial greed. Julian and Beatrice were already moving to invoke the incapacity clause, which would grant Julian power of attorney over Alara's non-trust assets. But Alara knew Clause 4 was a legal labyrinth. It required proof of permanent and irreversible incapacity, certified by a board of independent physicians appointed by the original settler, not Julian's hand-picked doctors. Marcus, acting on Alara's silent command, quietly began stalling the certification process, citing unforeseen legal complexities. To Eleanor Cho, review the capital expenditures for the last 12 months. Flag all expenditures exceeding $500K, lacking my direct biometric authentication. Freeze all non-essential liquid reserves by classifying them as environmental risk mitigation funds under the new California regulatory changes. This was genius. Julian had been using Alara's paralysis as a cover to siphon off funds, small amounts that added up rapidly. By invoking a completely legitimate but recently introduced environmental regulation, Ellie was able to legally lock down hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate accounts. Julian, the ambitious financier, could hardly argue against regulatory compliance, especially not publicly. He would hit a bureaucratic wall of her own making, leaving him cash poor and unable to execute the massive corporate stock sell-off he was planning. Alara played the part of the compliant victim perfectly. Julian would occasionally wave documents in front of her, papers to sign for routine asset management. She would take the pen, stare blankly, and sign with a deliberate, agonizingly slow scrawl that was barely legible. But she wasn't signing what they thought. She used a high-resolution camera on her tablet, disguised as a bedside photo frame, to take clear pictures of the documents before signing them. These images were immediately forwarded to Marcus, allowing him to anticipate and neutralize every single legal move Julian made. Betrayal, Alara reflected as she watched. Julian cheerfully talked to Chloe outside her window, is less painful when you realize it's just a predictable pattern. And every predictable pattern has an exploitable loophole. The centerpiece of Julian and Beatrice's final move was Alara's majority stake in Vance Construction. They needed to seize and sell these shares to a hostile third-party bidder whom Beatrice had secretly brokered a deal with. They had set a deadline, the day after the divorce was finalized, claiming Alara needed to liquidate high-risk assets for her long-term care. Alara's countermeasure was breathtaking in its audacity. Working with Ellie, she initiated a covert stock transfer. Instead of selling the shares, she moved them, not into a personal account, which would be too obvious, but into a complex series of employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, and philanthropic foundations that her father had long supported. She didn't transfer ownership, she transferred custody and voting rights. The shares were now technically owned by thousands of loyal Vance employees and a major children's health charity. Julian couldn't sell them without the consent of the foundation's board and the majority vote of the employees, a political and bureaucratic nightmare that would take months, if not years, to unravel. The instant Julian attempted the sale, the transaction would be automatically flagged as hostile, triggering a public and internal revolt. When Julian finally brought the liquidation papers to her bedside, boasting about the huge financial opportunity she was missing, Alara simply smiled the same small, vacant smile she always used. The moment he left, she messaged Ellie, "The vault is now empty. Let him enjoy the illusion of the key." Julian thought he was hunting an invalid heiress for her fortune. He was, in fact, walking into a financial maze constructed by the very woman he thought he had incapacitated. He was preparing to open the door to the vault, not realizing Alara had already emptied it and replaced its contents with a tripwire. "The greatest victory is often won long before the final battle," the quiet voice observed. "It is won in the patient accumulation of evidence, the silent maneuvering of pawns, and the absolute mastery of one's own composure." Alara was not just surviving, she was reclaiming her power, one encrypted message and one frozen dollar at a time. Her revenge was not a sudden burst of anger. It was a cold, calculated masterpiece of corporate demolition. In the theater of betrayal, the villains rarely recognize the pivotal moment when the tide turns against them. They mistake their victims' continued existence for proof of their own cleverness, never realizing that the curtain is about to rise on their final, catastrophic scene. Julian and Chloe had watched Alara for months. They had observed her supposed apathy, her quiet acceptance of her fate. They saw the vacant stare, the listless movements, the total reliance on their care. To them, she was a finished painting, signed and delivered to the gallery of her own personal tragedy. Now, with the corporation's assets seemingly bottlenecked by unexpected regulatory issues, a hiccup Julian hadn't anticipated, but dismissed as bureaucratic sludge, it was time to finalize the most important step, the legal severing of all ties. Julian approached Ilara one crisp California morning, not with pity, but with a practiced air of weary compassion. He sat beside her wheelchair, not touching her, his face a mask of manufactured melancholy. He held a neat stack of papers, tied with a silk ribbon, the divorce petition. "Ilara," he began, his voice lowered to a bedside intimacy that made her stomach churn. "We need to talk about the future. Our future, and yours." He launched into a well-rehearsed monologue about irreconcilable differences, citing the stress of her condition, the toll it had taken on his own fragile mental health, and the simple, sad truth that they were different people now. His most damaging and most calculating assertion was the clause regarding her mental instability. He gently suggested, with feigned concern, that her ongoing grief and withdrawal meant she was not in a state to make sound decisions, a detail meant to reinforce his prior attempts to gain control of her financial affairs. He was being generous. He offered her the Malibu mansion, the house he couldn't legally sell without her cooperation, and a seemingly substantial monthly allowance drawn from a trust he convinced her he had painstakingly set up for her long-term care. "This way," Julian explained, pressing the expensive pen into her hand, "you have absolute security, my dear. You won't have to worry about the market or management or anything complicated. You can just focus on getting better." Ilara listened, her eyes fixed on the distant ocean. She registered every lie, every subtle manipulation. He wanted the divorce to clear the final path to her corporate shares, believing that once she was legally separated, the complex ownership structure of Vance Construction would be easier to breach. He was offering her the cage she was already escaping from, while pretending it was a sanctuary. She took the pen, her hand steady, surprising Julian with the firmness of her grip. She signed the papers not with sorrow, but with the cool detachment of a general signing a truce before launching the final invasion. The signature was her liberation, the final confirmation that she was officially done with the Julian Vance chapter of her life. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice soft, devoid of any discernible emotion. "That is, a relief." Julian looked genuinely pleased, misinterpreting her relief as capitulation. He leaned over and gave her a chaste, almost perfunctory kiss on the forehead. "I'll always care about you, Ilara. Always." He then left her room, closing the door not with a soft click, but with a definitive thud that echoed the finality of their marriage. Ilara waited a full minute, listening to the joyful murmur of Julian and Chloe celebrating in the corridor. Then, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. Relief indeed. Within weeks, the pretense of grieving his marriage was abandoned. Julian and Chloe, now legally unencumbered, moved with speed and brazenness that bordered on self-parody. The announcement was a splashy feature in the Los Angeles Times Society column. Vance Construction CFO Julian Vance finds love anew with confidant Chloe Hayes. The engagement was an elaborate public spectacle, complete with drone footage of Julian dropping to one knee on a yacht off the coast of Capri, even though they had allegedly been deeply involved in caring for poor Ilara only months prior. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and exactly what Ilara needed. They were not just betraying her. They were publicly humiliating her, confident that the paralyzed ex-wife was too broken and irrelevant to respond. Then came the invitation. It arrived via a specially couriered box, heavier than necessary, announcing the wedding of Julian and Chloe. The cardstock was thick, gilded with gold leaf, and the photo was sickeningly intimate. Chloe leaning her head against Julian's shoulder, both radiating a glow of triumphant stolen happiness. The location was the exclusive Cielo Vista Resort, the very venue Ilara and Julian had once discussed for a future anniversary party. The final insult, the cruelest sting, was the inclusion of Ilara's name on the guest list. They hadn't omitted her out of shame. They had invited her out of vanity and sadism. They wanted her to be a spectral presence at their wedding, a visible reminder of their victory, a tragic figure in a wheelchair watching their final ascent. "It takes a truly small soul to invite the person you betrayed to witness your spoils," the storyteller commented. "It is an act not of malice, but of profound, arrogant overconfidence." Julian even called her, ostensibly to ensure the invitation had arrived. "We'd love for you to be there, Alara," he said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. "It would mean so much to me. Just a small sign that you've moved on, you know? That there are no hard feelings." Ilara's response was measured, perfectly pitched to sound slightly strained but compliant. "That's very kind of you, Julian. Yes, I will be there." The pause on the other end was telling. Julian and Chloe, who were on speakerphone, exchanged a quick, disbelieving laugh. "Wonderful, darling," Chloe chirped, trying to sound supportive. "It takes such strength to do this. We'll make sure you have the perfect view." They hung up, clearly satisfied that the pitiful former heiress would attend, thereby validating their humanity and sealing her humiliation. But in the quiet solitude of her room, Alara did not cry. She took the invitation, ran a finger over the ornate gold lettering, and crumpled it slowly, deliberately, into a perfect, silent sphere of paper. She then opened her secure messaging app and sent 2 final, urgent updates to Marcus and Ellie. To Marcus Thorne, "The date is set. The transfer of the ESOP voting rights must be executed 3 hours prior to the ceremony start time. The legal filings are to be held and released at my personal signal." To Eleanor Cho, "Execute the Black Swan Protocol on the morning of. All Shell Corporation debts are to be called in. Leave no ambiguity. Their credit rating must be destroyed by noon." Ilara was not attending their wedding as a heartbroken guest. She was attending as the final witness to their destruction. They had sealed her fate with a divorce paper. She had accepted their invitation to deliver their judgment. The dance floor was open, and Alara Vance was finally ready for her grand entrance. They say the most dangerous enemy is the one you refuse to see. Julian and Chloe saw a ghost in the wheelchair, a tragic footnote to their new beginning. They never suspected that this ghost was meticulously sharpening the blade that would carve up their future. The arrival of the gilded wedding invitation was the final, critical piece of Alara's puzzle. It wasn't just a piece of stationery, it was a formal declaration of their arrogance, a confident flourish that certified their belief in her utter powerlessness. They were inviting her to the grand finale of her humiliation, and Alara accepted with the serene joy of a strategist who has just watched the enemy walk straight into the kill zone. Her quiet reply, "I will be there," had created the desired effect, a ripple of smug amusement throughout the mansion. Julian and Chloe didn't even bother to mask their contemptuous relief. "She's actually coming," Alara overheard Chloe snicker to Julian during a late-night phone call with a mutual friend. "Honestly, it's pathetic. We'll have to tuck her away in a corner table, right? Next to the distant cousins. Just imagine the look on her face when she sees the venue, the one we chose." Julian, sounding equally self-satisfied, replied, "It's perfect. It shows we're good people. We took care of her, paid her off, and now we're letting her watch us move on. It's closure for the world, darling, and it ensures she can't make any noise about the settlement. She's too busy being the sad, dignified martyr." They had fundamentally misread her intention. Ilara wasn't looking for closure, she was looking for commencement. The wedding date was no longer a day of mourning. It was the designated day of reckoning, the moment the coordinated strikes of her physical recovery and financial maneuvers would converge into a public, inescapable reality. The period between the invitation and the wedding became Alara's most intense phase of preparation. Her secret sessions with Arthur grew longer, more demanding, pushing her past the point of physical exhaustion. She was no longer just standing. She was learning to walk with purpose and confidence, eradicating the unconscious limp and hesitation that Arthur meticulously policed. "The way you move must betray nothing," Arthur insisted one night, his voice a low, steady rumble as Alara walked laps around the darkened living room, relying only on the sliver of moonlight. "They expect fragility. You must deliver strength. Every step must be a lie that makes their truth unbearable." She practiced her stride until her legs burned with fiery agony, until the pain became a dull background noise. She practiced ascending and descending the few shallow steps leading to the patio, knowing that the entrance to the resort's ballroom would likely require navigation that a paralyzed woman simply could not manage. Her revenge was measured in repetitions, in milligrams of recovered muscle strength. Concurrently, her strategic communication with Marcus and Ellie intensified. The final phase of her plan, the unveiling of the evidence, required perfect timing and seamless coordination. Marcus Thorne, the lawyer, was tasked with compiling the legal payload. This included 1. The complete, undeniable proof of Julian's systematic financial embezzlement from Vance Construction, using the flagged transactions Ellie had provided. 2. The engineer's signed affidavit detailing the sabotage of the car brakes, secured through discreet offshore channels. Sen. The documentation confirming the non-transferability of Alara's stock due to the ESOP and Foundation custody agreements, effectively proving Julian's inability to seize control of the company. We have to hit them legally before they can even process the physical shock of seeing you walk, Marcus had stressed. The moment you appear, their first instinct will be damage control. We must make the damage irreversible. Ellie Cho was coordinating the financial shockwave, code-named the Black Swan Protocol. This involved leveraging the various debts and failed investment schemes Julian had secretly funneled company money into. On the morning of the wedding, Ellie was set to trigger a domino effect, recalling loans, liquidating collateralized assets, and issuing public financial statements that would expose Julian's reckless mismanagement and potential fraud. The objective was not just to stop him, but to financially vaporize him right as he was celebrating his ill-gotten gains. Alara also made one final, deeply personal preparation: the dress. She secretly commissioned a little-known designer, a friend from her architecture school days, to create a gown. It was not a wedding dress, nor was it a dress of mourning. It was a dress of declaration. She insisted on the color vivid crimson. It had to be structured, bold, and utterly commanding, designed to flow and move with power. It was the antithesis of the muted, comfortable clothing she wore daily, as the invalid. It was armor, tailored not for protection, but for impact. As the wedding day drew closer, Julian and Chloe became noticeably more relaxed, more celebratory. Their conversations revolved around seating charts, the floral arrangements, and their impending honeymoon, a final golden period of tranquility before Alara brought the storm. They had completely forgotten the inherent danger of a wounded prey. They saw her silence, but they didn't hear the roar gathering beneath it. A predator's patience is often mistaken for passivity, the voice murmured. They believed she was an afterthought, a defeated memory. But for Alara Vance, every day in that wheelchair, every agonizing step in the dark, every encrypted keystroke was a silent, meticulous preparation for the single, devastating act that would forever be known as the last dance. She looked at the invitation again, the heavy gold script mocking her. She ran her finger over the date. It was perfect. She had bought herself enough time. She had the evidence, the legal backing, the financial weapons, and now she had the physical capability. Julian and Chloe had sent her an invitation to their triumph. She was preparing to send them an invitation to their downfall. She smiled, a genuine, cold smile that held no warmth, only the fierce promise of inevitable justice. Her attendance was no longer a symbol of her defeat. It was the delivery notice for their karma. The night before, a great battle is always the quietest. The decisions have been made, the strategies are locked in, and all that remains is the deep, profound stillness before the world is irrevocably changed. For Alara Vance, this was the final breath before the storm. The Malibu mansion, usually a place of echoing silence and artificial calm, felt charged with an almost unbearable tension. Julian and Chloe were gone, having traveled south to the ultra-exclusive Cielo Vista Resort for their rehearsal dinner and pre-wedding festivities. Their absence was not just a physical void, it was a psychological relief. Alara was finally alone in the structure she had designed, a spider in her own perfect web. She was not in her wheelchair. Standing before the full-length mirror in her master suite, a room Julian had avoided for months, claiming the sadness there was too much. Alara looked at her reflection. It was not the reflection of the helpless invalid he knew. It was the face of a woman who had fought a year-long war in solitude, her eyes now burning with an unshakable, cold resolve. She was wearing a simple, dark silk robe, but the strength radiating from her was palpable. Arthur had left just an hour ago, their final session complete. It had been less about physical therapy and more about psychological tuning. He had walked her through the expected sequence of events, reinforcing the need for composure, for the deliberate slowness of her movements, and the absolute power of her presence. "They will be stunned into silence, Alara," Arthur had told her, his voice low and serious. "Use that silence. Let the truth do the screaming. You are not a dancer on this stage. You are the conductor of their chaos." Ilara lifted her arms, testing her balance. She was rock steady. The scars on her legs were fading, but the memory of the pain, the searing, daily agony of defying the doctor's prognosis was a permanent internal steeling of her will. She ran a hand over her custom-made crimson gown hanging nearby, encased in a simple black garment bag. It was more than a dress. It was the banner of her vengeance. Her focus then shifted to the true heart of her attack, the digital arsenal. On her tablet, disguised as a recipe book app, lay the entire horrifying truth. She scrolled through the files, a chilling testament to Julian and Chloe's depravity and Beatrice's criminal orchestration. The audio files, the voices of betrayal. These were the crystal-clear recordings from the smart home's reactivated microphones. The intimate laughter, the callous discussions about her medical prognosis, Julian's detailed explanation of how he instructed the engineer to just pinch the lines enough to cripple her, not kill her, and Beatrice's chilling advice. "A widow is harder to control, Julian. An invalid wife is a goldmine." The financial log, the proof of greed. Spreadsheets provided by Ellie Cho detailing the millions siphoned off, the failed foreign investments, the fraudulent loan applications, and the attempts to sell off her Vance Construction shares. The logs culminated with the final, desperate actions Julian had taken in the last week, unaware that every move was being countered by the Black Swan protocol. The numbers didn't lie. They spelled out grand theft and financial ruin. The legal affidavit, the smoking gun, the signed and notarized statement from the former brake engineer. He had been offered a lifetime's wage to tamper with the lines, believing the accident was only meant to be minor. He provided receipts for the bribe money, linking it directly to an offshore account controlled by Beatrice. Everything was backed up, triple secured, and pre-programmed. Alara was not bringing physical evidence. She was bringing a portable digital courtroom. The core evidence was loaded onto two separate, encrypted flash drives. One for her personal presentation, and one her ultimate insurance policy already delivered via secure courier to Marcus Thorne, with instructions to release the complete file to the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office if she failed to check in by 4 p.m. the following day. She moved to the kitchen, preparing a light, simple meal. This calm, routine act was an integral part of her mental preparation. She was not fueled by hysteria or rage. She was operating on cold, clear focus. Julian and Chloe had believed their wedding would be the symbol of their ultimate success, the merger of their ambition and lust, blessed by the world's most exclusive society pages. They planned to stand together, triumphant, looking down upon the world and upon Ilara. Ilara's intention was singular, to ensure that the moment Julian said, "I do," his entire world would say, "You are done." She thought about the look on Beatrice's face when the matriarch of the family realized her own secret, that Julian was not a Vance, would be revealed. This was the one detail Alara was saving for the very end, the personal twist of the knife. Beatrice had spent her life clinging to the Vance legacy. The idea that her son, her instrument of greed, was completely disenfranchised was the ultimate, poetic justice. "They took my life, they stole my love, and they tried to take my name." Alara whispered into the empty room, her voice now strong, resonant. "Tomorrow, I will take back everything, and I will leave them with absolutely nothing but the truth of their own making." She climbed into her bed, not for rest, but for stillness. She closed her eyes not to sleep, but to visualize the scene. The altar, the guests, the expectant, smug faces of Julian and Chloe. And then, the opening of the doors. Her entrance, the shock, the silence, and the single powerful word, "I object." A silent victim is often the most observant, the voice concluded, the tone low and final. They thought her eyes were vacant. They thought her mind was broken. But in the quiet darkness of this night, Alara Vance was not resting. She was preparing to deliver the final, irrevocable masterpiece of her life, a masterpiece composed entirely of justice and retribution. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. But on this specific Saturday afternoon, at the opulent Cielo Vista Resort, the roles were about to be violently reversed. The actors who thought they were leading the show were about to be exposed by the woman they had cast as a tragic prop. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom was an intoxicating blend of wealth, imported white roses, and the heady aroma of unchecked ego. Julian Vance stood at the altar, impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit, his face radiating the smug confidence of a man who had successfully exchanged a damaged asset for a dazzling new acquisition. Beside him, Chloe Hayes, radiant in a gown that had cost more than Alara's annual maintenance budget, looked out at the assembled guests, her eyes bright with triumphant vindication. Beatrice, Julian's mother, sat front and center, a picture of regal, approving pride, the silent architect of this glorious, wicked moment. The ceremony proceeded with the predictable pomp and sentimentality of a high society wedding. The string quartet played Vivaldi. The officiant spoke of destiny, commitment, and the beautiful future awaiting the happy couple. Julian and Chloe exchanged a deeply intimate, private smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret, their shared victory over the poor, pathetic invalid who was supposedly watching from afar. The moment came, heavy with destiny, when the officiant reached the solemn, age-old query. His voice boomed slightly across the perfect silence of the ballroom. If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be lawfully joined in matrimony, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. Julian and Chloe stood still, a subtle smirk playing on Julian's lips, a tiny flicker of impatience in Chloe's eyes. This was the empty, ritualistic pause, the space where no one ever speaks. Then, a sound. It was not a voice, but a sharp, authoritative clack that cut through the air, followed by a rhythmic, deliberate echo. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of high-heeled shoes striking marble. Every head in the room swiveled towards the massive carved mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The doors did not simply open, they were pushed inward with a resolute force. Framed in the blinding afternoon sunlight stood a figure who defied logic, defied pity, and defied their deepest, most desperate expectations. It was Alara Vance. She was not in a wheelchair. She was not dressed in muted, comforting colors. She wore the dress of declaration, a stunning, high-necked gown of vivid crimson silk, a stark, unapologetic contrast to the pristine white of the wedding. Her hair was pulled back tightly, revealing the sharp, clean lines of her jaw, and her composure was absolute. Every deliberate step she took, her body perfectly upright and balanced, was a thunderous denial of the medical reports, the insurance claims, and the last year of their lives. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was the sound of a world collapsing. Gasps rippled through the guests. Cameras flashed erratically, their operators momentarily forgetting their function. The string quartet simply stopped playing, mid-note. On the altar, the transformation of Julian, Chloe, and Beatrice was immediate and visceral. Julian's smug confidence fractured into a mask of pure, white-hot horror. Chloe's radiant smile evaporated, her eyes wide with a combination of disbelief and primal fear. Beatrice, the seasoned matriarch, actually gripped the edges of her chair, her face draining of color as she instinctively understood that the game was fatally compromised. Alara continued her walk, slow and measured, the clack of her heels on the marble floor, the only sound. She did not rush. She traversed the entire length of the ballroom, a crimson vision of inevitable justice, until she stood directly beneath the altar, looking up at the three people whose lives she was about to dismantle. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing out, calm but carrying the force of an avalanche. "I object." She paused, allowing the word to hang, heavy and final. "I object," she repeated, this time with a small, cold smile that was more terrifying than any scream, because the groom is a thief, a sociopath, and an attempted murderer, and the bride is his co-conspirator, his mistress, and the woman who slept in my guest room while I fought for my life. Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, panicked protest. "Alara, what is this? This is insane. Get her out of here. She's mentally unstable." Chloe, meanwhile, was scrambling for the one thing they still possessed: their phones, their means of defense. "No, Julian," Ilara said, her voice cutting through his panic with the precision of a scalpel. "The days of me being mentally unstable or incapacitated are over. I did not walk in here today just to disrupt your party. I walked in here today to deliver your reckoning." She held up a sleek, black tablet, not her usual domestic device, but the one loaded with the legal payload. "This entire beautiful venue," she continued, turning slightly so her voice addressed the stunned guests, the major shareholders, and the journalists now scrambling to record the moment, "is being paid for with funds stolen from my family's company, Vance Construction. Funds that my husband embezzled while I was supposedly too paralyzed and depressed to notice." She gestured towards the massive projection screen that had been intended for the wedding video montage. In an instant, the screen flickered to life, showing not sentimental photos, but a cold, clear, undeniable image: the signed affidavit from the brake engineer. A collective gasp swept the room. "You didn't just abandon me, Julian. You didn't just cheat with my best friend, Chloe," Alara stated, the indictment sharp and unyielding. "You instructed a man to tamper with the brakes of my car. Not to kill me, because then you couldn't access my trusts, but to cripple me, to make me an invalid so you and your mother—" She turned her gaze directly to Beatrice, who looked as if she might faint, "could legally steal my inheritance, my company, and my life." The screen instantly changed, displaying the audio file interface. Alara pressed play. The voice of Julian filled the room, cold and utterly devoid of remorse. "Just get the lines cut, not severed. Understand? She needs to survive the impact. I need her alive, but absolutely immobile. That's the only way Beatrice can get the power of attorney." The voices of Chloe and Julian laughing about her helplessness, about how easy it was to manipulate her financial passwords. The voices of Beatrice and Julian discussing the imminent sale of the Vance Construction shares to the hostile bidder. The chaos became immediate. Guests rose from their seats, murmuring, shouting. Journalists surged forward. Julian lunged towards Alara, his face contorted with murderous rage. But two of the largest, most discreetly placed guests, two of Marcus Thorne's private security detail, posing as distant family, immediately intercepted and restrained him. The screen then flashed to the final, devastating image, a corporate financial summary. Beneath it, a single line from the Vance Construction Board of Directors. "Julian Vance and his co-conspirators are immediately terminated and subject to criminal investigation for corporate fraud and attempted murder. The shares you plan to sell, Julian, are no longer mine, and they are certainly not yours," Ilara announced, her voice rising slightly, cutting through the din. "They are now held in an employee stock ownership trust and a philanthropic foundation. You have nothing left to steal." By noon today, the Black Swan Protocol was executed. Every shell company, every secret account you established is in ruins. You walked into this church a wealthy thief. You leave it a bankrupt criminal. As the uniformed officers of the LA Police Department, prearranged by Marcus Thorne, quietly entered the ballroom, Alara took one final step towards the altar, lifting her hand to the microphone the officiant had abandoned. "This is not a wedding," she declared to the now silent, stunned assembly. "This is a police raid." She watched as the handcuffs snapped onto Julian's wrists and then onto Chloe's, their triumphant faces now twisted into masks of utter, deserved defeat. "There is no greater stage for true drama than a wedding built on a lie," the storyteller observed, the voice now low, heavy with judgment. Ilara had not just walked, she had commanded. Her silence was not her surrender. It was the deafening promise of her absolute, irreversible justice. They say that karma is a slow-moving force, but sometimes, on the grand stage of human endeavor, it arrives with the devastating speed of an unexpected lightning strike. For Julian, Chloe, and Beatrice, that lightning struck at the precise moment they believed they were immortal. The final moments inside the opulent ballroom were a whirlwind of shattered glass and broken dignity. The crimson-clad figure of Alara Vance stood as the calm epicenter of the chaos. The sight of Julian and Chloe, once so arrogantly radiant, being led away in handcuffs, their faces streaked with tears and disbelief, was the first dose of an immediate public justice. Beatrice, the manipulative mastermind, remained frozen in her gilded chair, the full realization of her failure slowly dawning. She was not just losing her son and her status, she was facing legal consequences that money and social standing could no longer erase. Alara watched them go, her face impassive. She had completed the mission. The thieves were caught, the corporation was safe, and her physical strength was public proof of their criminal intent. But true justice, the kind that cuts to the bone, often saves its sharpest edge for the very end. As the officers moved to escort Beatrice, the elderly woman finally snapped. The years of carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing a desperate, vicious core. She fought the officers, her voice a harsh, reedy shriek aimed directly at Julian, who was being passed by the altar. "You idiot, you fool. I did all this for nothing." Beatrice screamed, her eyes blazing with a horrifying mix of betrayal and madness. "You destroyed everything. You think you are entitled to the Vance name? You are not a Vance." The words sliced through the remaining murmur in the room, stopping even the police. Julian, his face already white with defeat, turned back, his expression a mixture of terror and confusion. "What are you saying, Mother? Stop lying!" Julian roared. Beatrice, now held firm by the officers, spat out the ultimate, decades-long lie. "Your father, Mr. Vance, was not your father. You were the result of a brief, idiotic affair I had in Geneva. I married him pregnant, Julian, and I forced him to give you his name. Every plot, every scheme was to secure a legacy that was never yours. And now, you've ruined it all." The ballroom plunged into its deepest silence yet. The shock of the attempted murder and fraud was nothing compared to this revelation. Julian, the ambitious financier who had spent his entire life planning to seize the Vance legacy, the man who had crippled his wife for a fictitious inheritance, was a fraud from the very beginning. He had no claim, no right, and no blood connection to the fortune he had destroyed himself to acquire. The police led Beatrice away, her screams echoing down the hall. Julian simply stared at the empty space where his mother had been, his entire existence, his power, his ambition, his identity dissolving into a lie. He didn't look at Alara. He stared at the marble floor, the image of absolute, hollowed out destruction. And just like that, the storyteller reflected, the voice slow and heavy, the true nature of karma was revealed. It does not just punish the action, it annihilates the motive. Julian's greed was rooted in his desire for a birthright that was never his to claim. Alara finally descended the altar, her crimson dress, a solitary spot of color amidst the wreckage. She didn't approach Julian. She had delivered the truth. Her work was done. In the ensuing weeks, the fallout was swift and absolute. Julian and Chloe were denied bail, facing lengthy sentences for corporate fraud, conspiracy, and attempted vehicular manslaughter. Beatrice was placed under arrest and charged as the ringleader. Vance Construction, protected by Alara's strategic maneuvering, weathered the scandal, its reputation ultimately solidified by the swift, decisive action of its true leadership. Alara Vance, no longer the broken invalid, but the formidable heiress, stepped fully into her role as CEO. The physical scar of her injury remained, a constant, faint ache, but it was no longer a sign of her vulnerability. It was the medal of her resilience. She continued her physical therapy, not out of necessity, but out of a commitment to her own strength. Standing in the quiet sanctuary of her mansion weeks later, watching the sun set over the ocean she once thought she'd never walk beside again, Alara closed her eyes. She hadn't sought revenge out of bitterness, she had sought justice out of necessity. They had tried to erase her. She had chosen to reappear, more powerful than before. The greatest power a person possesses is not their wealth or their physical strength, the voice concluded, the tone measured and profound. It is the inner resilience to rebuild, brick by brick, the life that others tried to demolish. Never underestimate the silence of someone who has endured too long, because in that stillness, They were not falling. They were reforming. They were not surrendering. They were calculating. And when they finally spoke again, their voice became the thunder that shook their betrayer's world.